Welcome back. So, if you're back today, we're getting ready to start in our fourth week in the book of Judges, chapters 13 through 16. And as you can see, so far we've not been canceled by the network, and we're still doing this through the coronavirus era. We're hoping that soon we're back together, but until we are, we're going to keep on carrying on. And so today we've got a really good message from the book of Judges. In the past few weeks, we've done a couple of judges each time. Today we'll mention a few judges, but primarily we will spend our time talking about just one judge today. That'll make it a little easier on you. It's certainly going to make it a little easier on me. And we'll kind of explain why that is as we go through it. So today's judge is going to be the 12th judge, and we've said all along that there were 12 judges total in the book of Judges. And there was one anti-judge, but there were 6 minor judges and there were 6 major judges. And so today we will just briefly touch on 3 minor judges on the way to our 12th and final judge, which is Samson. And most of us have heard the story of Samson since we were little kids in Sunday school. Even if you didn't go to Sunday school every week as a child, you very likely have heard some story about Samson. And you have an image in your mind. It may be cartoonish, but you've got an image of some big strong guy with really long hair. And so we're going to see today that that's absolutely true, but we're also going to see there's a whole lot more to this story than we heard obviously as children. You know, Paul says in Corinthians, he was talking about the church having spiritual milk, and it was time to move on to spiritual meat. So I'm going to kind of think of it that way this morning as we get started, that what I learned as a kid in Sunday school was wonderful, but it was spiritual milk. And I hope today when we leave, we'll have a little more meat to hang the references of Samson, the importance of Samson, because he does some very unique things in the book of Judges, and we're going to get to see those in some detail. Today I've got several different things to show you as well, and I'll bring them up as we go through each one. There'll be some maps for the minor judges. It'll just be a quick map. There'll be a map specific to Samson that I think I want to toggle back and forth throughout the lesson, because it was really good for me as a teacher to be looking at that map as I prepared these notes. So let me stop here for just a second. I'm going to bring up our sheet that has the list of judges. We'll look at a few items on that, and I'll be back in just a second. Okay, so on the screen now you see the list that we've been working from the last couple of weeks. We're showing the who, the where, the when, and the what of the judges of Israel. And we're going to cover the last 4 today, so that's on the bottom side of this sheet. So let me switch over to it. And you'll see at the bottom 4 judges that we've not discussed yet. They are 3 minor judges, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And there's going to be the major judge, Samson, today, where we'll spend primarily all of our time talking about Samson. So I do want to show you a couple of quick maps to give you an idea where the 3 minors were at. These guys were also contemporaries doing this at roughly the same time. If you'll see the date line there's some overlap. And you'll also notice on the date line, we're now at 1075 to 1055 BC. So that's the 20-year period of Samson's reign. But also notice that that's much closer to the actual time this book was written. So we get a much more full account of Samson, we think, than we do from other places. So here's the map that we've been using every week as well. I just wanted to show you for the couple of minor judges that one of them's from Zebulun, which is in the top center of the screen to the left. One of them's from Ephraim, and then Samson himself is from Dan. And as you look at this map and see Dan right there on the left middle at the coast, notice the cities of the Philistines that we've been talking about all along, the Ashdod and the Ekron and those. I'm going to switch to a much better map for the story of Samson today, so hang on and let me give you that as well. So I found a really, really good map of nothing but the story of Samson and the surrounding areas. And if you'll notice on the screen, top middle, left middle, the cities of Ekron and Ashdod, it gives you some idea. So it's the exact same map, it's blown up a bit. And if you'll notice the green line, it's going to give us the path that most of the story of Samson takes place on. And we will toggle back and forth. I won't cover it any more than that for the moment. But notice before it gets off the screen, the top center, he's starting out in a town called Zorah. Okay, so when we left our map, we said that we were at the town of Zorah. So let's start the story there this morning in chapter 13, verse 1. And like a lot of the earlier judges, it starts very familiarly. It's going to say in verse 1, "Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So just like has happened in the previous Judges, we now have an opportunity of, we're under the distress portion and looking for deliverance. So this morning, the story starts with a gentleman by the name of Manoah and his wife, who happens to be barren. Now she's visited by a gentleman who says to her, you are no longer going to be barren, you are in fact going to carry a son, and he's going to be set apart to the Lord. And in fact, not only will he be set apart to the Lord, he will be a Nazirite. You know, way back in a couple of months ago, we were in the book of Numbers, and it's Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 21 will give you a description of a Nazirite vow, and I'll just quickly touch on a couple of things. One was a person, man or woman, could be dedicated to the Lord for the purposes of God, and during that time they were to not cut their hair, and they were to not partake of anything grape. And if you recall, we were kidding in the class at the time, said couldn't even have a grape jelly biscuit. So no grape, and the hair couldn't be cut. There was also some prohibition about them being around dead bodies. So this gentleman has come to the wife of Manoah and said, you're going to have a child, and he's going to be a Nazirite. Now she comes home and tells the hubby, and he says, now, somebody told you what? Said, boy, if that's true, that would be wonderful. And he goes and prays, and he says, Lord, if this is true, send this man back so we can ask some questions, because if this is true and it's that important, we want to make sure we get it right. We want to be good parents. We want to make good decisions. We want to ask some more questions. So because of his prayers, Manoah prays, and the gentleman shows back up. Now, the wife is in the field now, again, Manoah's wife, and he comes to her again, and then she comes home and says, Manoah, come with me, let's go back. The guy who told me that we were going to have a baby is back, and you can come and ask him all the questions you want. So Manoah goes with her, and they go back. Now, neither one of them at this point realizes that this gentleman is the angel of the Lord. So Manoah talks to him in like a very gracious person who's very thankful for what somebody has said and done for him. He says, hey, sir, you have been good to tell us really good news. Why don't you come home and eat dinner with us? That's the least we can do. And he says, he even goes on and says, now, by the way, what's your name? Not realizing, again, that he's not dealing with a prophet or just a guy passing through. He's dealing with the angel of the Lord. I think it says down in verse 18, the angel replies, why do you ask my name? It is beyond understanding. So at this point, Manoah begins to get the idea. This is not the average guy wandering through town. This is somebody extraordinarily special. And we're going to see in just a moment the imagery of that very much so. So Manoah goes and takes a goat, and he goes home and he starts to have a sacrifice. It says Manoah took a young goat together with the grain offering and sacrificed it on a rock to the Lord. And the Lord did an amazing thing while Manoah and his wife watched. As the flame blazed up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended to the flame. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that's an extraordinary image to me. Manoah has been having this conversation with this gentleman, and the wife has had two conversations at least with this gentleman. And they're still not aware of the significance of who they're dealing with. And here in this moment of sacrifice, he actually ascends in front of them in the flame of the fire. Now that reminds me like Elijah being taken to heaven, you know, in a chariot of fire, or Jesus in the book of Acts ascending to heaven. What a fantastic picture that must have been. So I think it obviously has got Manoah and his wife's attention. So they're attuned, and in fact Manoah is terrified that they've seen God now. He's this wasn't just a guy. We have just seen the angel of God, and he's afraid that they're going to be killed. But the wife, as the wives do, they kind of slowed him down and said, wait a second. If God was going to kill us, he would not have come and made this promise. And so it says on in verse 24 at the end of chapter 13, it says, the woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him while he was there between Zorah and Eshtaol. And Zorah is where he was, like say, the hometown there. Now, as we end this chapter, before we go to the next, I want to do one quick point there. It says that the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in Samson. So Samson's now a child and has been anointed as being something special, set apart, a Nazarite. Now there were other judges of the 12 that we've covered, the previous 11, who had the Spirit of the Lord. In fact, I'm trying to remember, Othniel had the Spirit of the Lord. It said at one point whenever he was fighting the Aramites. Gideon had the Spirit of the Lord whenever he took his 300 trumpets and defeated 135,000 Midianites. And then the last one last week was Jephthah, who was fighting the Ammonites, and it said the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Now, in each one of those instances, just for grins, because I love counting, I love seeing things, I love squeezing the scripture for what it's got to hold. Each time, they were only said one time in each of those accounts that the Spirit of the Lord visited those judges. Today with Samson, our last judge, the 12th judge of the list, the 4th judge who's been visited by the Spirit of the Lord, he's actually going to have 4 different accounts in this where it says the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson. And I'll point those out as we go through. I just think that's significant that he definitely was anointed. He definitely had a purpose. And not with only his human purpose, but God was using him in a great and mighty way to achieve God's purpose. So as we said in the beginning, they're up in Zorah. But this next chapter, chapter 14, Samson and his family are going to make a couple of trips to Timnah, and you see that on the green line there. And he's also, at the end of this chapter, going to go down that same green line with the arrows to Ashkelon. All right, so we saw that he started out in Zorah, and we saw that in this next chapter that we're getting ready to cover right now, in chapter 14, that he's going to make a trip to Timnah. In fact, they're going to make a couple of trips, him and his daddy and his mama. So the story goes that Samson's grown up now, the Spirit of the Lord started to come upon him, and he decides he wants a wife. And as we all know, being good Jewish students that we've been for the last few months, what was the number one thing that both Moses and Joshua said to the Jews when they came into Canaan? They said, do not take a wife and intermarry from anyone other than your own people. And of course, the story of Samson goes just opposite of that. So that's the backdrop. So obviously Manoah and the wife were very much concerned about this. But it says in the first couple of verses of chapter 14, and this is the important part, it says, his parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. So Samson has gone to the city of Timnah, where he and his mom and daddy going, because he said, I see this young lady I like over in Timnah. I'd like to go and see if we can make arrangements to have her be my wife. So they make a trip, and on the way, Samson, leading the group ahead of everybody, is attacked by a lion. Now, again, I didn't know there were lions in Israel then, but obviously there were. And when the lion attacks him, it says, this is one of the occurrences of the Spirit of the Lord. I think in verse 6, it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. So he kills this lion, and he goes back to the group that's on their way to Timnah, and he does not tell his mom and daddy that he's done this. So they go to Timnah, they see this young lady, everybody agrees that he likes her, she likes him, and they go home. It says sometime later in verse 8, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass, the carcass that he had killed on the way on the trip the first time. Now this time when he goes, it's been some period of time, because now there's a bee's nest full of honey. So the carcass had to obviously decay, which might not have taken but a few days with the bugs or whatever else. But a bee's nest has been built. So it's not just been a day or two. It's been a little bit of time between these two episodes. But they've come back to settle on, I guess, the final details of the marriage. It says he gives his parents, he goes and takes some of the honey from this bee's nest and gives it to his parents as they're traveling again back to Timnah this second time. So he gets there, and when he does, his daddy's with him. It says, now his father went down to see the woman who he's going to marry, and Samson made a feast there, as was customary for bridegrooms. And when he appeared, he was given 30 companions. Now, I guess the way to look at this was the Philistines are a power that has taken over the Israelites. So there's still animosity here. So the fact that an Israelite has come to town to marry a Philistine woman, I'm sure they weren't thrilled with to begin with. So whenever they come, this Manoah and Samson and the mama, the bridegroom party is made up of Philistine people, not of Israelite people. So the wife provides 30 groomsmen for Samson. Now, as it goes, being a man, I get this. If you're ladies, you can get a good chuckle out of this. Samson, I'm sure, felt some competition because, again, these were people who had taken over Israel. He's there marrying one of their women. And so, as men will do, he makes a bet with the 30 groomsmen, I think, just out of sheer competition and look at me and I've got this, you're not going to bother me. He makes a bet with the 30 groomsmen, and he says to them, if you can answer a riddle of mine, I'll give you 30 pairs of clothes, which at the time was a big deal as far as that was like money. It says, but if you can't, then you guys have to give me 30 pairs of clothes. So he gives them a riddle, and the riddle's based upon the story of the lion and the honey. And the riddle says, out of the eater, something to eat, out of the strong, something sweet. So for a couple of days, the first 3 days anyway, they have no idea. And being men, all 30 of them, they're thinking, oh, we're not going to let this little Israelite boy come up here and embarrass us. We want to know. But being slightly crazy men, the Philistines went on to do something which you didn't really expect in the storyline. In verse 15, it says, on the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Now, obviously, that got everybody's attention. So the wife now on day 3 has said to Samson, I need you to tell me. Now she's got a death threat, and she goes back to him. And Samson says, you know what? Said, I've not even told my mom and my daddy. I don't have to tell anybody anything. I assume, and it's an assumption only, Samson thinks he can protect her and her dad from anything that might come along the way. But by day 7 of the feast, the wedding feast lasted 7 days. Now we're 7 days into the marriage. She's about convinced him that he needs to give her the answer to the riddle. She goes and gives it to the 30 Philistine guys who have been pushing to win the bet on their end. And when she does, they come to him, and they're in verse number 14. It says, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? So they give him the answer that he'd to the riddle, and thereby win the bet and win the 30 pair of clothes. So the next verse up says, verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. Now this is the third time the Spirit of the Lord's come upon him. The first time when he was a young man. The second time was whenever he killed the lion on the way to Timnah to first meet his wife. And now this third time. And so the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. He went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 of their men. Ashkelon was the city we saw down on the green line a moment ago on the map. So he's gone to Ashkelon, one of the 5 principal cities of the Philistines, and he goes there and he kills 30 men and takes 30 pair of clothes. Now, I'm not sure that the 30 groomsmen who are going to win this bet realized that's what was going to take place. I'm sure if they had, there would have been more problems for both sides. So he turns around and brings back 30 pair of clothes. Now, whether or not they were cleaned and pressed, I very much doubt. But he turns in the 30 pair of clothes. And then it says, the next verse, says, burning with anger, he went up to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to the friend who had attended him at his wedding. The father-in-law thinks, well, apparently Samson's so mad, and he's so mad at us for telling it, I'll just marry her off to one of the groomsmen. And he does. Now, Samson's gone for a period of time, and then he shows back up in chapter 15, knocking on the door at the father-in-law's house and says, hey, I want to see my wife. And, of course, the father-in-law says, well, I thought you were so mad you would never come back. She's been given away. Why don't you take my younger daughter? She would be fine if you'll take her too. Now, Samson, again, is already, like I said, felt some, not embarrassment, but felt like he'd been won up by losing the bet, if you will. Now he's completely and totally upset that his wife has been given away to one of the groomsmen, one of the 30 groomsmen. So he says to himself, now I have a reason to punish these Philistines. Now this is exactly what God had intended all along. He's used this marriage outside of the Israelite faith between an Israelite and a Canaanite to create this situation, because he's going to use Samson as a singular effort to try to push back at the Philistines. So it says, Samson says, I have the right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. Now, it's a very different way he's going to harm them, but boy, I can imagine this worked really well. It said in verse 1 of chapter 15, I'll back up just a second. It says, later at the time of harvest, excuse me, at the time of the wheat harvest. So this is when this took place that he's talking to his father-in-law about, where's my wife? And he says, oh, she's not here. Well, in chapter 15, and he's mad now, what he does, he goes out and captures 300 foxes, ties 150 foxes to 150 foxes by the tail, and of those pairs, he ties a lit torch on the end of each of those pairs of foxes and releases them into the wild. Now think for just a second. It's the time of harvest. All season long, everybody's put in all their effort to grow the wheat field, and it's just about next week we're going to pick it off and do all our work, get all the bounty and all the benefit of our effort. But instead, because of what Samson does here, this is a devastating blow to the Philistines and the people of Timnah, where this is. They turn around and now all of a sudden all their crops are being burned by the foxes. Now they are absolutely beside themselves and want to know who did it and why they did it. And the folks turn around and say, well, it was the son-in-law of the Timnahite. So they're saying his fiancee that he didn't marry and her father are the ones that, it was their son-in-law, Samson, that did this. Now they were already, like I say, a pretty wicked, mean bunch. Like I say, they were going to burn her out over the not giving the answer to the riddle earlier. Well, now, because she was even slightly associated with Samson, they turn around and kill both her and her father. So Samson's lost his ex-fiancee and his ex-potential father-in-law because of this. Now, they go after him. The Philistines are not real happy, so they decide they're going to go after him and make sure that he's punished as well. And they go to a place called Lehi in the the tribe of Judah, and they go looking for him. And Samson has hidden himself in a place called the Cave of Etam. And we'll look at that on the map in just a second. At the conclusion of this, I'll come back. So he's in this Cave of Etam. The Judahites are standing there looking around and saying, hey, Samson, do you not realize that the Philistines are our overlords? What in the world were you doing? You have stirred the pot big time. They are going to really be upset. And in fact, we need to turn you in. So the Philistines have come to Judah. They've camped at this place called Lehi. The Judahites have found Samson in this cave and said, we really need to turn you in. And Samson says, well, I'll tell you what, boys, if you want to turn me in, as long as you promise you won't harm me, I'll let you turn me in. So 3,000 men of Judah go to Samson and tie him with 2 ropes around his wrist. So he's got 2 ropes tied around him and 3,000 men of Judah, and they deliver him to the Philistines. And it says, when he delivers him to the Philistines, that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him again. So now that he's been delivered to the Philistines, the Spirit of the Lord comes one more time. This is the 4th time. And he takes the 2 ropes around his wrist, pops them like string, like nothing, and then turns around and kills 1,000 of the Philistines that have come to get him. Now, how did he kill them? You know, we were talking about how Shamgar was ill-equipped with a ox goad. We said it was a stick with a nail on it. Samson's incredibly ill-equipped as well. It says he kills him kills the 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. So he's got a donkey's jawbone, and he's swinging that thing and kills 1,000 people here at the end of chapter 15. At the end, it says, Samson says at the end, with a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. So he's letting them know, you know, you're not going to one-up me, you're not going to embarrass me, you're not going to do wrong to me, and I'm going to stand up for me. And he was also standing up for Israel. Whether he understood that or not, he was doing exactly what God had intended all along, which was to begin the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines during this 40-year reign. Okay, so before we go too far, let me go back to the beginning, and you see at the middle of the top there, Zorah. And you see just to the left of that, Timnah, and that's where all this was taking place with the fiancé.
whenever that took place and he let the foxes loose and it burned down the grain fields, and then he ran away and went back due east to that little red dot there called the Rock of Etam, right there on the edge of Judah. And so the Judahites, of course, turned him over to the Philistines, and that gets us to where we happen to be at the moment. Now, beyond that, the next chapter is going to take place mostly in the city of Gaza, which is the bottom left of your screen. So I want you to kind of get a good image of that, and I'll come back to this map one more time at the end.
Okay, so we saw some of the story of Samson in the first 3 chapters of this section, chapters 13 through 15, through the eyes of 2 of the women in his life. One of them was his mother, and then we also saw and talked about his fiancée that he turned out not to end up marrying. So chapter 16 very similarly has 2 women in it, but a little bit different, and you'll see the storyline behind that. Now we are in Gaza, which we just saw on the end of the map. And it says in chapter 16, verse 1, it says, "One day Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her." So this guy has now become disillusioned, obviously, with marriage and anything that goes with it, and now he's spending his time in a very different way. When he's there in Gaza, one of the 5 principal cities of the Philistines, he's an outlaw, obviously. He just killed those 1,000 people, and they're still looking for him. So the men of the town lay in wait, hoping that he'll come out in the morning and they'll capture him and punish him. But instead, in the middle of the night, he wakes up. Perhaps he realizes, it doesn't say that for sure, but he gets up in the middle of the night and leaves instead and goes to the city gates. And there he uses this long hair and this great strength that we all know about from the early Sunday school classes we had years ago, and he destroys the gate with his bare hands. And it says he carries the gate to the hill overlooking overlooking Hebron, which is in Judah. And the scholars think, at least the commentators that I'm reading, they think that he did that kind of as a protest to the people of Judah and said, "Hey, you turned me in, look what I could have done to you." But nevertheless, he escapes and goes on about his business. Now, he goes to a place on the map, and I'll show you that in a second, called the Valley of Sorek. That's in verse 4. And there he's going to pick up a girlfriend. So he left the prostitute behind, but now he's decided he will have a girlfriend. And so this is the one that you and I hear about. At least it's the one I heard about as a child, Samson and Delilah. So Delilah is a lady from the Valley of Sorek, and she and Samson are now becoming live-in boyfriend, girlfriend, and he's there with her, and she is approached by the Philistines, who again know that he's staying with somebody and they're still wanting to punish him. She's approached by a group that says, "Hey, we will give you 1,100 shekels of silver per person," and apparently there were several of them. It was a rich sum of money. If clothes in the earlier chapters were big money, can you imagine what silver was? It says, "If you can determine what his weak spot is and how we can capture him." So the girlfriend has decided, well, he's a nice guy and all, but there's a lot of money on his head. I think I can turn him in. So she goes to him and she says to him, "Oh, Samson, if you love me, you would tell me the source of your strength." And he gives her, on 4 different occasions, various answers. And the answers range from, they said, 7 fresh thongs. A thong was a plant-based material for making ropes. At one time he tells her, "If you tie me securely with new ropes, that would do it." Another time he says, "If you will weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin, then I'll become weak as water." And finally, he gets tired of hearing her say, "Well, you just don't love me, because that's not what happens every time that you do that. Your strength is still there." Finally, he tells her the truth, which is, "If you cut my hair and shave the hair off my head, then I would lose my strength." So one night she does just that, has the Philistine men that are paying her these 1,100 shekels, or their people anyway, come in and capture Samson. Now when they capture him, they take him back to the city of Gaza, where he'd torn the gates off. And that was another one of their principal cities. It says in verse 21 of chapter 16, "Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding in the prison. but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. So they got their revenge. They got their man and they gouged his eyes out and made him a prisoner. I guess pushing a millstone would be my guess. It says let him grinding in the prison. So he probably was pushing a big millstone like a horse would. But then they couldn't leave well enough alone, as people sometimes do, especially arrogant people, and the people of the Philistines were an arrogant, evil bunch. We've heard that from God's word time and time again. So instead of letting bygones be bygones and let him in prison just rot, they decide they're going to bring him out and embarrass him even further. So they bring him into their temple to be a circus sideshow, if you will, to show his feats of strength to a group in the temple. So it says the people in the temple were in high spirits and they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison and he performed for them. Now in this temple of their god, who was Dagon, who was the father of Baal, the other Canaanite gods, in this temple they had a group of people on the floor, but they also had above them on the roof, it says 3,000 people above the viewing area. So maybe it's like an amphitheater, I don't know, or not an amphitheater, but a theater with a second level, I don't know. I'm going to show you in just a few minutes a picture to give you some idea. But anyway, there's 3,000 men sitting on top, or men and women sitting on top of the arena. And Samson says to the guy who's guarding him, he says, "Hey, I'm tired. Can you take me over to the pillars of the arena where I can lean up against them and get a little bit of rest?" And so he does that. And when he gets there, Samson prays to God, says, "O sovereign Lord, remember me, O God. Please strengthen me just once more and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, and bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. It says, "Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived." So he kills 3,000 plus people in one blow at the end. Now we're going to take a quick moment to look back at the map so you kind of get an idea where this took place again and when. And we're also going to take a look at a picture of an archaeological find of a Philistine temple and give you some idea. And then we'll conclude today with some final remarks. So as we look at our map one last time, take a look at the very top left little box there. It says, "Delilah betrays Samson, who is seized by the Philistines and taken to Gaza." That's where he was with her. That's where they were together. And then, like it says, the Philistines capture him there and take him to the city of Gaza at the bottom left of the screen. We'll close with 2 final pictures. One's just an artist rendition of what it would have been like for Samson to push those pillars across. And you can see the people falling off the top and being crushed underneath the weight of the temple itself. But also the second picture getting ready to come up. This is an actual archaeological dig of a Philistine temple. And I love seeing that kind of thing because if you'll notice, the 2 main pillars were definitely something that was part of the way their architecture was done. Don't you just love how these Bible stories come together and how there's so much more depth in them than what we originally think, especially as kids? I mean, every time I read the Bible, I find something more fascinating than the last time. Let's close today with a couple of things about Samson, and then we'll talk about what's coming soon. Samson typifies Israel in a lot of ways. Samson was anointed by God, if you will, to start with. He was... the angel of the Lord came and announced his birth and that he was going to be somebody special. Just like the angel God came to Abram and said to him, Israel's going to be special. I'm going to use them for my purposes. Samson's mom was told the same thing. Also, they're both unique in their power. Samson was given tremendous superhuman strength because of his hair. Israel was given superhuman strength because if you looked out in the field, there was a pillar of fire and cloud every single day leading and directing and giving them direction that no other country on the face of the earth ever had or ever will have again. So they were unique in their own power. Also, Samson, as we saw, had an affinity for foreign women. And so Samson started out trying to marry the lady from Timnah, a Philistine. That didn't work out. Ends up with a prostitute in Gaza. That obviously didn't work out. Ends up with a girlfriend later on from the valley of Sorek who was a Philistine. That didn't work out. Kind of reminds you of the same stories we keep hearing each and every week in the book of Judges, because Israel, who was supposedly betrothed to God, went to the gods of the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Aramites, and anybody else along the way. And each time God had to send an oppressor to clean up their act and get their attention back on him. So they had been adulterous with God, much like Samson had been adulterous in his affairs with women in this world. And I guess finally, Samson in his final act said to God, give me strength just one more time so I can destroy these people and fulfill your purpose. And God's purpose was fulfilled in that the Philistines were several thousand killed, and the oppression that they had been over Israel at that time was relieved. And so Samson did exactly what he was supposed to do for the purposes of God. Well, Israel is going to see something over the next months as we're together, Lord willing. Is going to see the death of the nation Israel sometime later in 721 and 586 BC. We'll see both the Assyrians and the Babylonians destroy what's remaining of Israel. And that story's unfolding each week as we go through it. But in that time, think of it this way too, just like Samson fulfilled his final purpose, Israel's final purpose was to produce a Messiah for me and you, for every Christian and every human being. And because of that death of the nation that's going to come later on, the Messiah will eventually come from just as God said. And so we will see that story unfold every single week, Lord willing, that we're able to keep on moving through. We're going 3 or 4 or 5 chapters at a time, so it's a ways down there. But stay with us. It is the most fascinating, most wonderful story ever told, because the story is God had a plan, and God had you and me in mind whenever he set it in motion. Hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll do this again. Next week we will close out the book of Judges with chapters 17 through 21. Some more great stories. Please come back.